There are a ton of tools surrounding the process of writing code, such as source control, code hosting, build systems, CI/CD tools, package managers, and more. In the past, companies would cludge together these tool conglomerations to get a process that worked for them. Individual developers, on the other hand, typically did everything with a minimal set of tools and a lot of manual processes. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to a tool that changes all of that for both individuals and companies. It's called Azure DevOps. The best part is that unless you're an organization with more than 5 developers or making more than $1 million in revenue each year, this product is free to use. But before we get started, if you're new to this channel, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. Whether you're new to C# or have used it for years, you should be able to find something here that will benefit you. I also have a number of courses on Teachable that might benefit you. You can check them out at www.imtimcorey.com. Okay, let's get started. Now, I already have an Azure DevOps site set up, but if you don't, you can go to visualstudio.com to get started. And right here, the third option is Azure DevOps. And it's formerly VSTS because of the fact that it used to be named Visual Studio Team Services, but they changed the name to be more reflective of what it does. However, just so you know, it does not have to work with Azure. That's one of those misconceptions that came with a new name. And it's a tool that is really agnostic to pretty much everything. If you want to build Java applications, no problem. If you want to build Python applications, if you want to build C++ applications, it can do all those things, not just C#.NET into Azure. Okay, so get started for free, set your account up, and once you do, you should have something like this, only you'll not have any projects open yet. Now on this account, I have 2 projects myself, and we'll get into the Lifecycle project, which we'll use to kind of demonstrate all the things you can do in VSTS, or in Azure DevOps. But if you're going to start out, upper right-hand corner, it says Create Project. And here, you give it a project name, which is going to be this name right here, like Lifecycle Project. And then you give it a description, which is what shows up right here. The project name and description can be changed later if you want to. Now, in my settings, I have turned off the ability to have a public repository or public VS or a DevOps platform. Now, you can change that if you want in this organizational policies to either turn it on or turn it off. So for mine, by default, is turned off so that I don't accidentally create a public project. But if you want to create a public project, that's great. Also notice that Azure DevOps does allow for public projects just like GitHub does. And if you do create an open source project, then they'll give you a lot more benefits as far as how many different projects you can compile at the same time and how many people you can have in the project and things like that. So there's a lot of benefits if you do make an open source project. But I find typically projects are closed source because there's something you're working on either privately or want to actually sell. So those options are all you really need to get started. However, the advanced options do allow for 2 more tweaks. And the first one I would recommend you not change unless you really want to. And that is version control. By default, Azure DevOps works on Git, the Git version control system, which is not something they control. It's something that the community in general, it actually came out of Linux, but something the community in general creates as an open source project for source control management. It is by far the most popular source control management out there, especially for newer projects. Now, there's an awful lot of teams out there that are still using older source control systems, but typically because they have to deal with legacy applications, they have not moved out of other version control systems. The other option here is actually one that Microsoft puts out called Team Foundation Version Control. It's one that is more legacy support than it is frontline support. But if you have a project that you really want to have backed by Team Foundation Version Control, that's where you change it. Also, the work item process. And this is one that's much more dependent on what you want to do. And that is, do you want to use Agile, CMMI, or Scrum as your project management system? Now, all this affects is some of the naming of your work items. It does not affect how the source control is managed. It's more about the process around your building of source control. And we'll look at that in a little bit. But by default, Agile is fine unless you have a reason to change it. So create the project, and when you're done, you'll have one of these projects. Now we're going to select the Lifecycle project. This is actually a project we created in my application lifecycle design course. So you get to see some of the things that we've set up with this. So we click on it. This is what a project will look like when you come in once you've configured it. Now, your project will not start this way. It'll start out blank. We'll actually create one of those as well. In fact, let's do it now. Let's create a project. We'll call this the DevOps demo. Something like that. We'll leave the advanced alone. Create. And so now instead of that more full look to your project, you're going to see a little bit more bare bones like this. And so what it's saying is there's no stats. There's only one member. We're just getting started. Where do you want to start? So when you're starting off with a project, the first place you typically want to start is with the code. That's because really this whole process is around code. So I would start in the repos. That's where your code is going to live. Now here, this is a great tool right now because it offers you multiple ways of getting started, and it gives you here's the steps to take for any of those different ways. So for example, if you want to clone your computer, here's how you do that. Here's the URL, just hit copy and copy it, or you can clone right to, and there's all these different options, which is amazing, but Visual Studio is probably the one you want. Or you can push right from an existing repository, or you can import a repository, or, and this is my favorite, you can create a README and add a git-ignore file to get started. Now, if you're not familiar with Git, there is a concept called a git-ignore file, which actually starts with a dot. So .git-ignore. And what this file is for ignoring certain things that you don't want in your repository. That's pretty important. For example, you don't want, if you're working with Visual Studio, you don't want the actual NuGet packages stored in your repository. There's no reason for it because we have what's called package restore, which means on build, it will bring down the packages you need. So you don't store those in the repository. Visual Studio creates a .suo file, which is used for some temporary settings for a specific project. You don't want that stored in the repository. And there's a lot of things like that behind the scenes that you might not even notice. And half of them are hidden. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a Visual Studio git-ignore file. And what that means is it's just going to create some standard ignore entries so that it can ignore the standard things that Visual Studio would create. So this is my favorite way of doing it because it gets started with, again, a README, which helps you describe your project, and also that ignore file, which helps you set up your repository correctly right out of the gate. So you say initialize. And now this is our code, which isn't a whole lot, but we have two things. One of them is our ignore file, which if we click on that, it shows us all the things we're going to ignore. Now its font's a little small. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger for you. There we go. So there's an awful lot of things like that .suo file that gets ignored. Anything in this file that's listed will be ignored. So the debug folder, the debug public, the release folder, these folders are all going to be ignored because these are built files and not something you need to have in your repository. So that's the ignore file. You can add things to it if you find there's something coming in that you don't want to come in. Or you can remove something if there's something you really wanted to have in your repository. Now the README, this looks really great. But the actual contents, that's the contents. It's what's called Markdown. And Markdown is a format that's kind of a mix between a standard text file and an HTML document. And what it does is it uses shorthand to create HTML documents without all of the stuff surrounding it. So for example, this is an H1 tag. So instead of putting in the angle brackets H1 and then slash H1 on the other side, we just use the pound sign. If you want H2, it's 2 pound signs. So really quick stuff. If you want to bold something, just put a star on each side of it. If you want to have a numbered list, just put number 1, period, space, and then the item, then number 2, period, space, and the item. And a dash does the bullet list instead. So it's really quick stuff that allows you to build out a file that's readable in text format, but looks even nicer in HTML format. And Visual Studio allows you to view it both ways. So this is where your code is going to live. You're going to find a lot of code here, and we'll go ahead and go back to that other repository to see some actual code. But to get started, you would just go to clone then, hit the copy button to copy this URL right here. And then when you go wherever you're going to go on your computer, say git clone, and then this URL. And it's going to create a new folder called DevOps Demo, or whatever you named it, and put your code there. So that gets you started. If you want to know more about Git, I do have a video on this channel introducing you to Git and how it works. But as long as you're familiar with Git, then this shouldn't be much of a surprise. Also, here's our commits, which we only have one right now, that initial commit that created the README and git ignore. We'll see a little more of a history when we get to the example project. And there's all the stuff you can normally do with a Git repository: pushes, branches, tags, pull requests. These are all located inside the repos folder. Now, as you notice, there's other folders besides just repos. For example, if we go back to overview page, the overview page is a great place to get started. Now, if you want what I had in my example project I quickly showed you, you can click the pencil icon here, and you can add a README file. So for example, the README file from Azure DevOps, or from the DevOps demo. You hit save, and now the README file will be here. Now, at first it says it can't find it, but as soon as you hit refresh, it'll pop in. So there you go. So now the README file is here, and the README file should describe what this repository is about, how it works, and so forth. Boards. Let's look at boards real quick. So boards is the idea that you can have a system in place for creating bugs and features and then work through what's called sprints if you're going to do agile, where you have the set of work you're going to do now, and then you're planning out future sets of work and when you'll do them. And so a board, backlog, sprints, all of this really comes down to is the idea of managing work items. Now, a work item can be a bug, it can be a feature, it can be an issue or a task. And there's other things here as well that fit into the agile story, the larger story of agile. For example, a user story. So a user story tells about a user and what one thing they would do. So for example, a user would log in and look at their profile information. And what you could do then is put tasks, bugs, features, other things against that user story. For example, we don't have a profile page yet. We don't have a login system yet. And just start adding things on there. And then as you complete those, you complete that user story or make it come true essentially. So, but everything revolves around this work items. So to create a work item, very simple. It's going to look complicated at first, got a ton of stuff here, but the reality is enter a bug, something isn't working. Worst bug title ever. And then if you want, you can assign to somebody, in this case, just me, because I'm the only person assigned to this repository. You can change the state from new to something else, but in this case, we're going to hit save. And now you can change the state to other states like closed, active, resolved. But really, just title, save. And now I'm done. If I go back to work items, you'll see something isn't working. It's unassigned right now. And so you start assigning things to people and getting work done that way. And that's really the whole process of this boards down here. The whole thing revolves around getting work done. So whether you're an individual person and want to just use the bug list and say, you know what, I'm just going to put stuff here so I remember, and then I'll take things off when I'm completed, or whether you want to have a team in place where you have boards and backlogs and sprints and all the rest, you can do that inside Azure DevOps at whatever level you want to do. Pipelines. So a pipeline, the idea is that you have a build system, notice the builds, that you can build your software, and then you have a system where you release your software to different environments. And I'll show you that in the other repository since there's no real code yet or build yet. Now, test plan, let's get through this. Test plan is more if you're a larger organization probably, where you actually have systems in place for more formalized testing of your processes, whether it's manual testing or automatic testing. And so you can set up manual test plans, for example, where you specify this is how you test something. And then when you push new software, a tester would come in and walk through the process and make sure it works and use this test system to indicate if something worked or not. The artifacts is another that you might use in a small team, but probably not as an individual. It really depends on how much code you're creating. But the idea here is you can create your own NuGet feed or NPM feed or other types of feeds. And what a feed is just a package management system. So you can grab packages from public sources as well and basically archive them for your own use, and then also put your own NuGet packages or NPM packages or whatever into this feed as well, which then can be used in the pipeline. So a little confusing possibly, but let's go look at a project that's in process, the lifecycle project, and look at a few more things that kind of make more sense. So for example, this README page right here, I've updated a little bit. Now, not much. It's pretty much a standard README page, except I've added the build status and deployment status entries. As you notice, I have 3 different builds: development, staging, and production. And each one of those is currently succeeding in its build, the last build. I also have 3 different environments I'm deploying to: development, staging, and production. Each of those deployments also is succeeding. And the build success rate is 94%, and deployment success rate is 93%, which means I've had some failed deployments, and we can look at those in a little bit. And I have 6 work items that have been created and 3 that have been completed. And so it kind of gives you this overview of a working system. You can kind of see at a glance on this page stuff that's going on in this repository. Now, if we go to boards and let's look at our boards, we have just a couple of things that are currently active. We can also go in here and look at like recently completed, and there's some completed items. And if we notice, let's look at this one right here. We can notice that it was completed, it's closed, worked on by Tim Corey. There's no description or discussion because I wasn't going to do anything like that when I have just one developer. But it's linked to a number of different builds. And so there's the builds, and that's where I actually committed the code that made this feature complete. So we can start bringing in and linking things together, such as when I commit code that works on a feature, I can tie those two together and say, okay, this feature was added in this build or this commit, and now I can walk it through the process of when it was published to various environments. Now in my repositories, I have a lot more code here, obviously, since this is an actual project. And you can also see, if we go to the commits, you can see a commit history of when things occurred and when different areas were built and by who and their status and all the rest. For example, that's an in progress status right there. We can also look at different branches. So there's the release branch, a little different, but for the most part, it's the same. And there's the master branch. Now, let's look at pipelines. This is the one we didn't really see in our blank project. Let's start with a build process. So the build process is actually pretty incredible. The build process allows us to do a number of different things on our code. For example, whenever I commit to the master branch, to any branch. So this gets triggered on any branch. And that's specified right here on trigger, enable continuous integration. Remember CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. And those two things are what Azure DevOps does really well. In this case, it allows for continuous integration, meaning every time I make a commit, it builds my code to make sure it works, and it runs a number of tasks, including my tests, my unit tests. So it makes sure my unit tests pass before it will say, yes, this is a valid build. And if it's not, it's going to send me an email and say, nope, that's an invalid build. And it's also going to put a red indicator on my overview page and say the build status is currently failing. Now, as you can see, there's a number of different things in here that I'm doing. It seems a little complicated, but the reality is that most of this I created just by when I create a new build. It said, do you want to build a ASP.NET page? And I said yes, and it put all this stuff in here for me. But if you want to add something new, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. Notice it's not all for .NET, like for example, Android signing, or if you want to distribute an iOS application, you can do that. For example, in deploy, we can look at down here, there's other options besides Azure, but of course, Azure is a big one. There's Kubernetes, there's SSH, you can even do machine file copy. It's really up to you. Using one of these tools is fairly straightforward. For example, if I want to create an archive or a zipped file of my built files, I would just hit add. It adds it to the list, and now I just fill out these options. It may seem a little intimidating with all these different placeholders, or these are actually variables that get put in place afterwards. So the build.binaries directory, how you know what that is? Well, there's this information that would tell you, or if you go up here to the information on the root of the item, archive file, you can get more information about this particular build process. But these right here, usually by default, the defaults work and they're all you really need. But if you want to change something, for example, the root folder or file to archive, click the ellipsis and you can select which file you want or which folder. You can say the lifecycle project, you can say user database or something else. Now it's going to create a zip file, and then it says, where do you want that? Well, the artifact staging directory / buildid.zip. So that's going to create a unique identifier for our zip file and put it in our artifact staging directory. We could again change that to something else. So all this is very, very easy to do. If I decide, you know what, no, I don't want this anymore, I hit remove. Done. So it's just an add, remove, tweak things. You can move things up and down. For example, I can move this to the top if I wanted to, which would make no sense, but I could. And once you get that figured out, you trigger a build, make sure it works. If it does, great. If it doesn't, tweak it and start over. Let's look at some recent builds. So here's a build I did. And notice the log file has a whole bunch of different entries in here, but notice one says I have a warning. I can go and click on it and see what that warning is. No files were selected for indexing. That's the warning. And I'm okay with that right now. But if I look at the build solution step and click on it, notice over here on the right, this is the scroll bar essentially. This is all the stuff that's done. And this is like watching the command line if you were to run MS build. And you can read through here if you wanted to and see everything that's going on. Now, typically we don't do that, But if you have an error, you can read through here and find the error. Usually it's in yellow or red, and look at what the error is and kind of identify what steps it was taken beforehand and where it may have caused a problem. All right, so that's a build, but then the cool thing is a summary. The summary gives you all the information about the build, including, hey, 100% of my tests pass, which isn't that impressive since I have 2 tests. But if I open it up, I can see the 2 tests, I can see the pass ratio, and how long it took to run these tests. So all of this comes built in for free with Azure DevOps. All this stuff comes just as part of the process. Now you may wonder, well, yeah, but once I build, what do you do? Well, in the case of this repository, I'm doing 3 different deployments. So I start off with a development deployment, which is going to get triggered off of a build of the master branch. So if we click edit on this, you can see the trigger right here says continuous deployment. That's the CD of CI/CD. Continuous deployment is enabled on the master branch. So when the master branch gets done building, take those files and then do one job, which is, in this case, I'm replacing tokens, which swaps out some of my like my connection strings and replaces them with connection strings for the development environment and those type of things. And then I deploy a website to Azure App Service, and I deploy my SQL to Azure SQL. Again, you don't have to publish to Azure SQL or to Azure App Services. You can deploy to IIS and your local SQL. It's up to you, or not even deploy to SQL. Now, if you notice, this looks an awful lot like the build process, and it really is. If I click Add, the same options are here. I can do the same options or similar options in my deployment or release pipeline. So in this case, I've got 3 different pipelines. They're triggered based upon different environments being built. So master, staging, and then the release build. And so with this, when I commit code, so every time one of these commits comes in and says, okay, this is new code, whatever branch it's on, it gets built. But then if it's on master branch, once it's done being built, then it comes down here to my release and it triggers the development pipeline, which pushes it all the way out to an Azure website. So within minutes of me committing code, a website in the cloud with a SQL server attached, actually 2 SQL servers attached, all of that gets updated and refreshed, and now my development environment in the cloud has the latest code. And I can test it and make sure it works in the cloud. And if it does, I can move the code to the staging branch. When I do that, it's going to get built and then pushed up to a staging server and a staging SQL database set. And then I can test it in staging. If it's all good, I can go right to production. Now, this is more of a team environment or a production application that's actually in use. But if you have a smaller application, or maybe one that's not that heavily used, you could skip all of this and do just one build pipeline, where if you push it to the release branch, everything gets pushed out to your release server. Otherwise, it's just your development server. Or you could skip all of that and have just one server and have that deployment happen every time you push or every time you trigger it. It's a manual process or it's an automatic process. I encourage the automatic process because it's so easy. The idea that just by committing code in Git locally and pushing it, I don't have to do anything else, and all of a sudden websites are being updated automatically and they work. That to me is the end goal of this system, is the idea that it's automated, it's hands-off, I don't have to worry about it. Okay? So that's a brief overview of Azure DevOps. You can go into project settings and tweak things. For example, if you noticed, I don't have 2 of the entries here. I don't have the tests and I don't have the artifacts. That's because I went into the settings right here and turned off artifacts and test plans because I didn't need them. They're still there, And actually, if I had stuff in there, when I turn it off, when I turn it back on, that stuff will still be there. It's just that it hides it from the list because I don't need it. So all this stuff in here you can tweak, you can change, you can actually set up service hooks to link into other systems, not just your own system. For example, if you use Jenkins or if you use Slack and you want to get alerts when things are done, all these kind of things can be integrated into your Azure DevOps. So really, I can't say enough good things about Azure DevOps. I really encourage you, if you write code, then go into visualstudio.com, set up a free DevOps account, and just try it out. Set some things up, maybe use some of those free credits from Azure to actually set up an Azure environment and a website and start the build process automation just to try it out. Because this is something that every company wants to get to, and even if they're not there, this is the type of process they want to get to. And this is a great tool to have in your arsenal if you're looking for a job, or if you're looking to make an impression at a job, or if you just want to make your life easier. Because really, automation is the goal. If there's anything that we do repetitively, we should automate it. We're developers. This is something we have to be doing because this is why we exist, to make things automated and better. And Azure DevOps is the way to do that in our own systems and processes. Okay? I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. If you do want to see the larger process of actually setting this up and configuring it and all this stuff that we did in the Lifecycle project, you can go to my website, www.iamtimcorey.com, and look for that course on application development design. But otherwise, let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions or thoughts. And thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.